Hi, everybody. This is BeerSmith episode number 121. Dr. Charles Bamforth joins me this week to discuss boiling your beer. Hi, guys. This is BeerSmith episode number 121. It's late February 2016. Dr. Charles Bamforth, one of my personal favorite guests, joins me this week to discuss some of the science behind boiling your beer. Thank you to this week's sponsor, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. You get 6 amazing issues each year, packed with information for brewers and beer fans. They're offering a new discount code now, which gives you 15% off everything that they sell, including subscriptions and training. The new code is BeerSmith 2016. I encourage you to check out this great new magazine for home brewers at beerandbrewing.com and use the offer code BeerSmith 2016. Again, that's beerandbrewing.com to get your 15% discount today. And also Anvil, amazing kettles, burners, and accessories to help you forge the perfect beer. Anvil is a new line of brewing equipment from Blickman Engineering, endorsed by brewing author John Palmer. Anvil is durable, it's reliable, it's a quality line of brewing equipment that's built to last. Find out more about Anvil at anvilbrewing.com. Again, that's anvilbrewing.com. And also BeerSmith Mobile at beersmith.com/mobile. Create, edit, and brew your recipes from your phone or tablet, and share or find new recipes from tens of thousands of recipes on the BeerSmith cloud. BeerSmith Mobile is available on iTunes, Google Play, or Amazon app stores. Give BeerSmith Mobile a try today. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, my guest is Dr. Charlie Bamforth, professor of Malting and Brewing Science at the University of California, Davis. Charlie specializes in the study of wholesomeness of beer, including beer perception, polyphenols, foam stability, oxidation, and flavor stability. Charlie's been on the podcast at least 6 times before, the latest being episode number 104 on malt. And Charlie, you're one of my favorite guests. It's great to have you back on the show.
Nice to be here. It's always a great pleasure.
And I'm glad you're back in good health as well.
Yeah, I usually am. But I had a bit of quite a lot of a cold actually, and it went to my throat. So you don't want me coughing and spluttering down the microphone. As my late father-in-law would say, not enough drinking out of a damp glass. But I'm okay now.
Well, Charlie, it's been almost 9 months since I last had you on the show. What are some of the new projects you're working on at UC Davis?
All sorts of stuff. One of the ones is my big class, the Introduction to Beer and Brewing class. We're putting it online, and so I'm busy recording all these lectures, and there's lots of animations being put in there as well. So that will go online probably in a year and a half. And
no kidding. What's that all about? Why are you recording?
Well, I'm slowly planning on winding down fully, and I know that I don't teach the big class on campus anymore, but we're putting it online so that, if you like, I'm recorded for posterity, and so people will be able to go online and take the class by distance learning, whether they're UC Davis students or beyond. So it will go out through university extension as well. So hopefully it'll prove as popular online as it certainly did on campus, where we had more than 1,000, 1,200 students every year taking the class.
You had 1,000 students taking your brewing class?
Yeah, not all at once. We did it 3 times a year, and the biggest sitting was about 550 students, and then the smallest was about 300.
That's amazing to me.
Yeah, they enjoyed it. It became the most popular class on campus. It pushed the class on sex into second place, and the class on
beer beat out sex, huh?
I beat out sex and food, But when you think about it, beer, sex, food in that order seems entirely logical. So we're doing a bit of research as well still, and we've been doing some interesting work on manganese recently, and
really.
Yeah, manganese, and people talk about iron and copper for promoting oxidation and staling, but manganese will do it too. And we found, that significant amounts of manganese can find their way into beer. And in particular, we've been looking at dry hopping, and you do seem to pick up quite a bit of manganese from dry hopping. And
I did not know that. I mean, I knew you have to have a little bit of manganese in the water in order to get healthy yeast fermentation, I believe, right?
Well, yeah, and it's like everything else. A little bit is good for you, but too much is not so good. So yeah, manganese has got some important functions, but if you have too much, it can promote oxidation. And as I say, we found that you can pick up some from dry hopping, and so we're looking more at that and seeing whether different hops will have significantly different levels of manganese, and precisely how you should do that to avoid too much manganese pickup. But,
so the hops contain a lot of it? I'm not familiar with this.
Well, they do. In fact, if you look at the total amount of manganese that actually comes into a brewery, there's more in the malt, but it sort of gets diluted out. But at the end of the day, if you're going to sort of heavily dry hop beers, it does actually lead to a significant amount of manganese uptake. And as I say, that can promote oxidation. Over the years, I've always said that the beers that you should worry the most about for staling are the ones that have got the gentlest flavor, because they won't disguise aging. But a lot of people have said to me, they worry about their pale ales and their India pale ales, and they do seem to deteriorate faster than they would like. And I'm just wondering to what extent manganese has a role to play here. We can't categorically link it through to that. It's simply very interesting that you do pick up this material from dry hopping.
Do you think that might be related to how we, sort of a lot of the bitterness and hop flavor degrades fairly quickly over time?
It may make a contribution. I'm not saying it's the whole thing, but it's certainly something that is interesting us at the moment, and I think it's a research area that perhaps others might like to get into as well. That's
awesome. Very cool.
Yeah. Or not cool, depending on what your perspective, But
well, I always think it's something new in brewing is always interesting to me.
Oh, it's interesting for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, today you actually wanted to talk about the boil today, which is obviously a critical step in brewing. Let's start with why it's so important to get a good, strong boil in your work.
Well, so much happens in a boil, and there are 6 major reasons why historically boiling became very important. The first is sterilization, killing off unwanted organisms. Of course, this is why beer saved the world, because when you boil the wort, you kill off the pathogens, and those poor people historically who drank contaminated water didn't survive. But if they drank beer, they were okay, because the wort had been boiled.
So beer did save civilization then, right?
Oh, totally. We wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have survived. I wouldn't be talking to you today if your ancestors and my ancestors hadn't drunk beer. If our ancestors had drunk water, we wouldn't be here. They wouldn't have lived long enough to reproduce, to pass on the genes.
Well, some of my ancestors are from Scotland as well,
Well, there you go. But they were drinking not only beer, they're drinking all sorts of stuff up there. So the second thing, of course, is inactivation of enzymes. So at the boiling stage, that's where you really seal the sort of the composition in terms of, that's where you've stopped any further degradation of materials. Third thing, of course, is precipitation. So you're precipitating out unwanted material, hop break, true, whatever you want to call it, which is part of stabilizing the product, so the finished beer is going to be more stable. The fourth reason is you're getting evaporation, so you're driving off water, and that, of course, can be very significant for certain beers, like barley wines, to concentrate the sugars, so that you're going to end up with a higher sugar level going to the yeast. So the yeast is going to make a higher alcohol product. The fifth thing, of course, is volatilization and the driving off of unwanted aromas. And that's what you smell when you go near a brewery. You can smell the boiling stage, and I always think, well, it's a great smell, but it's not the smell I want in beer. So that's because you're driving off all these unwanted and most of them unpleasant aromas, with the exception, of course, of some of the hop character. And of course, then we have isomerization. Although it's entirely possible to introduce bitterness in other ways these days, still it is the most frequently used way of extracting the bitterness, and the so-called isomerization, taking the hop alpha acids and converting them into the more soluble and the more bitter iso-alpha acids. So there's a whole heap of stuff that's going on in the boil, and you really have to address all of them because they're all important. There are things you can do to tweak it, but at the end of the day, these are the changes which are going to take place, and these are the things that you want to achieve efficiently. And there are some other chemical changes taking place as well.
Well, let's walk through some of the chemical changes that do take place during the boil.
Well, the two main ones I'd draw attention to. The first I've already mentioned. That, of course, is the isomerization of the alpha acids. So you are transforming the three alpha acids, the humulone, the cohumulone, and the adhumulone, and you're converting them into the isomerized form. There's 6 of them, and they're the cis and the trans isomers of the iso.
And that, of course, gives us a bitterness, right?
And that gives you the bitterness. So that's got to be efficient. To a first approximation, you get about 1% isomerization every minute in boiling wort at pH 5.2. So you're going to the longer you boil for, and the more vigorously you boil, the greater is going to be that rate of isomerization. The pH is important. The lower the pH, the more isomerization you're going to get. It may not be a dramatic thing, but certainly if you've got wort that is at the higher pH range, then the rate of isomerization is going to be less than it is at the lower range. So 5.1, 5.2. The rate of isomerization is going to be a little bit less than, say, it would be at pH 5.5, but it's probably not going to be dramatic. Now, of course, the yield of bitterness is going to depend not only on the extent to which you carry out this isomerization, but it is going to be dependent on to what extent these acids, alpha acids and iso-alpha acids, react with other things and get precipitated out and so on. But the simple rule of thumb is if you've got a vigorous boil, you're going to isomerize at a rate of about 1% per minute, 1% of the alpha acid every minute. And that's a very important thing. And I stress the word vigorous. For all of the things I've talked about, all those 6 different things, you do want a vigorous boil. The other major chemical change that's of significance is all to do with DMS. I think we've talked about DMS before, but in the malt and extracted into the wort, there's a precursor. We call it SMM, it's S-methylmethionine, but it breaks down when you heat to make DMS. And therefore, the more vigorously you boil, the more you're going to break down that SMM to make DMS, and the more that is going to be driven up the chimney and driven up the stack. DMS, if it survives into the beer, gives you sort of a canned corn, seaside, marine seaweed aroma type character.
It tastes like cream corn to me, but
it does, yeah. And of course, there are certain beers that it's supposed to be there. It's a very famous.
I had a couple of questions on that.
Yeah.
Obviously, you don't want to cover with a pot. You don't want to cover the pot when you're boiling, right?
No, not at all. You need good evaporation. You see, it's 2 things. And if we consider something like DMS, there's 2 things happening. The first is you want to break down that SMM to produce DMS, the precursor to make DMS. That depends on a vigorous, good boil. But also, you want to purge off that DMS. You want to drive it away. Well, most people do anyway. Most people don't want DMS around it. There are some exceptions.
I've had people ask me too, can I cover the pot while I'm heating it up before it boils? What are your thoughts on that?
No. Why would you? Why would you?
I don't know. Some people, they're working on a stove and the stove's underpowered,
Yeah. Well, then you might, because what a liquid will boil when the vapor pressure matches the external pressure.
Right.
So if you increase the pressure on top of the boil, then it will boil more readily, if you like.
The risk, of course, when you open that pot, you can quickly get a boil over.
You certainly can, and of course, the more let's say the more formidable is the barrier, the less volatilization you're going to get. So
but you certainly don't want to cover while you're boiling, because that's a big risk. Yeah,
correct. And of course, the other thing about this, and it's relevant to the DMS story, is a liquid boils, as I said, when you balance the vapor pressure and the external pressure. So if your external pressure is lower, the liquid is going to boil at a lower temperature. So here in Davis, we're 35 feet above sea level. In Golden, Colorado, they're a mile high. So a liquid boils at a much lower temperature in Colorado, up in the Rockies, than it does here in Northern California, down on the Central Valley. So this influences a lot of things. The liquid, let's say, boils at 94, 95 degrees centigrade. Mm-hmm. And I always insist on using centigrade or Celsius. Let's say it boils at that temperature in Golden, Colorado. It will boil at 100 degrees centigrade here in Davis. And this affects the chemistry that's going on. So this SMM, this precursor for DMS, if you're boiling at 100 degrees centigrade, it's gonna about half of it will break down in 38 minutes and give you DMS. But if you're 94 degrees centigrade, that's going to take about 76 minutes. Wow. It takes twice as long every time you drop the temperature by 6 degrees centigrade.
So that's why 90-minute boil is probably a good idea, especially if you're at altitude, right?
Yeah. So you've got to balance what the actual temperature is with how long you need to boil for. If you're going to match the same product made in greatly different altitudes. So if you've got one company that's brewing beers in, say, half a dozen different breweries, and they actually are at very different altitudes, you're going to have a significant effect on the flavor. You're going to have a significant demand, therefore, to change the boil to match the altitude and to change it so that you can actually produce the same wort and therefore the same beer in very different locations. So with the whole DMS story, what you want is this vigorous boil to break down the precursor, produce DMS, but it's got to be vigorous, otherwise it will stay behind. If you've only got a simmer, if you've got a gentle boil that is hot enough, but it's kind of what I always say to the students is going, it's this insipid little
bubble comes out every few minutes, right?
Yeah, and it's really hot. But you're going to break down the precursor and you're going to produce DMS, but that DMS is going nowhere, and it's going to stay in the wort, and you're going to end up with a beer that has got this significant cream corn flavor.
Another question I had for you. There's I've been to a number of commercial breweries, and I've been to some where they have the vent coming out of the pot and going straight up to the roof. With no insulation or anything on it. And right. I always get concerned. You got a cold pipe with steam flowing through it. What are the risks that the stuff recondenses and falls into the beer?
Yeah, if you're not volatilizing, if you're not driving off these volatiles, then they're just going to come back and come back to sit there and haunt you. So you've got to have two things. You've got to have this turbulence or this vapor stream, if you like, that's taking the stuff out, but it hasn't got to get back in again. So I'm no engineer. I you wouldn't look to me to design a brewery, but whatever you do, you've got to make sure that vapor is not going to run the chance of recondensing and coming back into the wort. It's got to escape.
I ran into it first in Brazil, where they actually had milk companies making some of the brewing equipment because they couldn't import it.
Right.
But I've seen it here in the United States as well. I've seen the breweries, and I've been able to taste the DMS in the beer.
Yeah.
Where they've got these vertical stacks coming off the boil thing that's not insulated at all.
Right.
And essentially you got a cold pipe with hot steam going through the middle of it, and it comes right back down into the beer, basically.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so you got to have it's not only the temperature and the vigor of the boil; it's giving it the chance to escape. There are some beers. There's a famous one in this country with with two words, and the second one is rock. And it's supposed to have a DMS character. It belongs there. And the biggest selling brand of beer in the United Kingdom is supposed to have a degree of DMS character, not so much. And the way you control it is to balance the length of the boil and the length of the hot wort stand in the whirlpool. If you don't want DMS in your product, you want a vigorous, lengthy boil with all the sort of the things we talked about, the good physical ability to remove it, and then you want a very short stand, hot stand in the whirlpool. You want to clarify it pretty quickly. If you want DMS, then you want a reasonable length of boil. Again, it should be vigorous. And again, you do need to get volatilization. But you then leave it in the whirlpool long enough for the precursor to break down to give the DMS. So if you want the DMS, you want a little bit shorter boil, but a much longer whirlpool stand. I
want to ask you a question about whirlpool as well when you get...
Okay. So I was responsible for the quality control in one of the breweries of that particular brand in the UK I was talking about. And we had a 1 hour stand in the whirlpool. It's 1 hour. Was how long it had to swirl around in there. And we did that so that we were producing the amount of DMS we needed. And then, of course, when you cool and you ferment, a lot of that DMS is driven off with the carbon dioxide. But as long as you've got enough in you produce it in the whirlpool, the hot wort stand, you estimate how much you need there to account for the amount that's going to be driven off by carbon dioxide, so that you can specify and achieve the exact specification for DMS in the finished product. It was very skilled, and the beer was not allowed to leave the brewery unless it contained somewhere between 40 and 60 micrograms per liter parts per billion of DMS. The specification was 50 plus or minus 10. And we felt it was very important. If you didn't have that, we felt it was lacking a certain lager character. But if you had more than that, we felt it was over the top. So a remarkable control we had to achieve that single species, that single volatile at exactly the right levels.
That's awesome. The question I want to ask you about whirlpool, we're seeing a lot of brewers, both commercial and home brewers, start to use more and more whirlpool hops, and starting to use longer whirlpool times or steep times because of that. And then you mentioned, of course, that also affects the DMS. How are those two related?
Well, the bottom line is that if you've got the precursor to whatever extent present after the boil, it is going to break down in the whirlpool if the whirlpool is properly insulated. If the whirlpool is holding the temperature and it's still way up there in the sort of the high 90s centigrade, then any SMM that's left behind, any precursor left behind, it is going to give you DMS. A whirlpool, it's very gentle in there. There's no pressure, if you like, no vector which is driving off the aroma. So anything that's in there is going to stay. It is going to stay. Now, if you've got a length of time of, say, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, it's not the biggest deal in the world. But the longer you hold in that whirlpool, the greater is the amount of DMS you're going to produce, unless you've had a really, really prolonged and vigorous high-power boil that is taking less SMM or precursor into the whirlpool. And of course, the other thing to bear in mind is that a lager malt, a paler malt, will contain a lot more of the precursor than will a darker pale ale malt. But even so, Brad, we analyzed DMS levels in a lot of ales in the United States, a lot of craft brews in the United States, and they had very significant levels of DMS, very significant levels of DMS, and this, I think, speaks to the brew house and the lack of vigor in the boil. People with a simmer and not an aggressive rolling boil. You really, really, for this and for all the other purposes in boiling, you do need that aggression inside a boil. You need that turbulence, what I call a vigorous rolling boil.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of the design of the systems. As I mentioned, a lot of them have the pipes coming straight out. Whereas if you go look at some of the high-end brewing equipment coming out of Germany, for example, a lot of them have a tube that comes out the top of the boiler and then goes down and actually forms a sump. Yeah. And of course they have a blower on it as well to draw the volatiles out.
You know, the crazy thing is, in terms of DMS, I mean, there is many a brewer in, say, the UK that actually thinks, a little bit of DMS is great. It gives you good lager character. And yet, if you go to Germany, unanimously they say this well-known defect, DMS, well-known defect, and yet they succeed in getting significant amounts of DMS in their beer, despite what the understanding of having to get good efficient volatilization, because the story is not just a matter of the boil. The yeast under certain circumstances, it too can make DMS. So it's a very complex story, but I've been looking at it now for over 30 years, that particular story, and there's still stuff we don't know.
Interesting. Let's talk about some other critical brewing goals that you might have during the boil. Obviously, you want a nice, long, vigorous boil. And we talked quite a bit about the volatilization. What are some of the other things you're working on while you're boiling the wort?
Well, as I say, one of them is precipitation and producing a good break, a good hop break. Tube formation is very important. Interesting thing is, I had a guy working on this for me years ago in the UK, that if you boil vigorously, you produce a better formed precipitate than if you just have a simmer. It actually settles out more readily later on in the hot wort stand.
So you're talking about primarily the proteins and polyphenols, right?
Proteins, particularly proteins. It's interesting, actually, if you compare hot break and cold break, the actual physics and chemistry of their production probably is different. With the boil and the hot break, it's much more to do with the proteins curdling, if you like, coagulating, denaturing, and becoming less soluble. The polyphenols are much more significant for cold break formation, and some degree of oxidation may be important there in terms of forming that precipitate by cross-linking with protein. So when it comes to hot break, there are things you can do, and obviously things you can do to improve the sedimentability, if you like. And one of them, of course, is Irish moss, carrageenan, which will it's a negatively charged polysaccharide, carbohydrate, and that will cross-link the proteins to make them bigger, and therefore they settle out more readily. But even if you're not using Irish moss, again, a more vigorous boil relates to better precipitation and better settling. And of course, the other thing that is very relevant here in the boil, of course, is this matter of evaporation. Many people will they'll quantify their boil on the something like percent evaporation, and they'll say, well, we're shooting for 5% evaporation or what have you. Fundamentally, the beers that are going to have the greatest evaporation, where you're looking for that, are the ones where you're wanting to have a higher sugar content over. For example, as I said earlier on, for a barley wine. So you're going to boil for a long time. And so on the one hand, you're going to get a lot of evaporation. You're also going to get some color formation as well. And you're going to get some flavor changes taking place, which have not been... They're not been as well studied as they might be, but which actually will contribute to the full flavor that you've got in a barley wine. in terms of flavor changes, however, you are going to produce some cooked character in a longer boil. The Germans talk about Furfurals and things like this. So it is a balance, and it really does depend on the beer style. If you've got a fairly robust, strongly flavored beer, and certainly one where you're shooting for a higher alcohol content, then a longer boil is going to be the norm. But if you're looking for something that is more gentle, a more subtle flavor, and you don't want to have too much cooked character in there, if you like, then an excessive boil is not going to be what you're shooting for.
So what would you recommend for an average homebrew batch? Is sort of 60 to 90 minutes sort of the right guideline, or something else? That would
be the right guideline in terms of the best balance. And the interesting thing is, the actual vessel shape and configuration is so critical. If you are boiling on a very, very large scale, then the chances are the ratio of the surface area to the volume is going to be smaller. If you're boiling in a smaller pot, then pro rata to the amount of liquid you've got there, you're going to have a proportionately bigger surface, and therefore you're going to get a lot more evaporation on a smaller scale than you are on a large scale, by and large.
Yeah, I think that's true. Homebrewers, it's not uncommon to get 15 or 20%.
Correct. So you're going to get. So I don't think evaporation has got quite the same meaning there in that if you boil for 1 hour in a small vessel and a big vessel, you might get the same degree of aged character, furfural notes coming in, because of that's going to be more of a function of the time and the temperature, but you're going to get a lot more evaporation. So just because you're getting a lot more evaporation does not mean that all the other chemistry that's going on is going to be that much different. You might get 20% evaporation, but the extent to which you're converting the DMS precursor to DMS is much more to do with the time and the actual temperature that you're using. So, but yeah. Your question was how long, then, 60 to 90 minutes seems entirely reasonable.
And is that true for extract brewers as well? I know some of them like to go with a lot less.
I think it's a good rule of thumb for anybody, I would say, to it's a good yardstick. It's a good yardstick.
Mm-hmm. Well, you touched a minute ago on the importance of vessel design. What are some considerations, when picking a pot or even designing a larger vessel for craft brewing?
Well, for any brewing, it is a case of getting this nice roll, this nice turnover going, this nice vigor of boil. There are all sorts of designs that people have had here at UC Davis, which is probably more sophisticated than most homebrewers would be looking at. We have something called an internal calandria, which is a sort of a tubular heating system that's inside the kettle, and basically the wort is siphoned through it. It's through the heating surfaces, and it is basically drawn through and upwards and fired up against a spreading plate, and so we get this. There's got this rotation going on like that all the time, and that makes for a lot of surface that's being created and a lot of volatilization, evaporation. Whatever it is, on a commercial scale, what brewers look for is what they call a low delta T, the difference in temperature between the heating material and the temperature of the wort on the other side of the metal, if you like, trying to keep that as low as possible, so that you're not abusing the liquid close to the surface of the heating surface. So whatever it is, it needs as much as possible to treat as much of that liquid uniformly as possible. And again, that's where sort of turbulence comes in. So you got movement, so that you're not sort of intensely heating a small amount of wort at the bottom of a vessel near to the heating surface, much more accessible than you are perhaps elsewhere. You want to be treating all the contents of the kettle as evenly as possible. So there are all sorts of new designs that are coming in, and lots of brew house suppliers have experimented with all sorts of different systems. What seems to be in vogue at the moment is the concept of stripping, which is using a vapor stream to actually replace thermal energy in terms of achieving volatilization, the driving off of unwanted aromas, so that whether you've got a stream of an inert gas, or whether you've got using the steam stream, if you like, then you're replacing thermal energy by this stream of gas, which is going to bring off the volatiles. There's nothing new in this, Brad. There's a very well-known company that makes a beer with an eagle floating on it, and they've had wort strippers in their breweries for years. So they boil vigorously, and then they have the hot wort stand and their whirlpool, and then they go through a device called a wort stripper. The wort is still hot, and they basically use air, to the best of my understanding, still to purge off volatiles, particularly DMS, so that they're continually driving this off.
So they do that even after the boil's over, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you mentioned some of the new brewing systems have that built into the boiler, though, or something?
Yeah, so the new there are different systems. There are systems, and your listeners could look up things like Symphony. They could look up Stromboli. Perhaps the one that's attracted the most attention is the Merlin system. And from recollection, the Merlin system, I've not used it myself, but I think basically the liquid is essentially in the whirlpool and is being cycled in and out of a whirlpool. It's too complex for me to explain, but the Merlin system. The important thing is, and the thing I emphasize to my students is this. If you're trying to make a certain beer and you've established that beer on the basis of a certain system, and at the moment I'm particularly thinking of a boiling system, you can't just switch out to an entirely different way of doing things. Because it is going to change the wort and it's going to change the product. So you say you've got a fairly traditional boil. Say you had one with a calandria, either an internal or an external calandria, and you say, we can save some money. We'll strip that out and we'll put in a Merlin system. You got to do a lot of experiments to recreate the wort for that product, so that you can match it entirely. Because if you change the amount of evaporation, or you change the duration, or you change the temperature, all of those things are going to influence the chemistry and the physics of what's going on. So it's not a trivial matter, So there's a lot of attention to proposing new systems that are more thermally efficient. And let's be frank, that's what people are trying to do, to save money. But if you change the system, you will change the product.
Yeah, that was one of the next questions I had for you is how do they save energy? What are some ways you can save energy?
Well, I mean, boil less, but also, employing different designs. Again, taking advantage of vapor flow. Once upon a time, people tried an experiment with high pressure wort boiling and low pressure wort boiling. If you boil and you put a higher pressure on top of the boil, then it will boil at a higher temperature. Mm-hmm. But if it boils at a higher temperature, you can boil for a shorter space of time. If you reduce the pressure, then it will boil at a lower temperature, and therefore you can save money by boiling to lower temperature.
And that's how extract's made, right?
Yeah.
They boil it at a fairly low temperature.
Right. But in a wort boil in a brewery situation, that's going to change the flavor. If you take the low pressure wort boil, it's going to boil at a lower temperature. Therefore, your rate of conversion of DMS precursor to DMS is going to be less, and it's going to change the flavor. Just one example. The to look at these is when you're building a new brewery. If I'm in the business of making a new brewery somewhere, and if I wanted to consider all the ways and means of saving money and so on, and therefore wanted to have a radically different way of boiling my wort, I'd be putting it in from day zero or day one. I wouldn't sort of say, well, try this for a year and then we'll switch out and bring in something else. It ain't going to work. Without a lot of experimentation and changing things, because at the end of the day, if you want to make a certain beer, you got to make that wort in a consistent and a standard way. And again, coming back to this matter of trying to make the same brand in very different breweries in different locations, the real challenge is because something as fundamental as altitude is going to influence the thing.
Interesting. Well, we've talked about quite a few of the things you mentioned. We haven't talked much about enzymes yet. Can you talk about some of the enzymatic changes going on?
None at all. There shouldn't be any because the enzyme should have been destroyed.
Right.
Actually, here's a little bit of a segue, but a colleague of mine, Makoto Kanauchi, and I have, we recently, last 2 or 3 years, found an enzyme that nobody has ever reported before in malt, and it's called ascorbic acid oxidase. Of course, ascorbic acid is vitamin C. And over the years, people have suggested putting ascorbic acid into the finished beer as an antioxidant. I think that's a waste of time. I don't think it works in the finished beer. But it's very interesting. We actually have done all sorts of experiments putting ascorbic acid actually into the mash. If you put ascorbic acid into a mash, this enzyme uses it to mop up oxygen.
Interesting.
And therefore you get less color development, and you get 1 or 2 other changes that look quite interesting. And if people are worried about oxidation in a mash, this is interesting. My brewer at the moment, Joe Williams, is doing some experiments on really saying what is the influence downstream. It's all very well saying you minimize oxidation in the brew house, but what happens all the way downstream, and does it have any adverse impact down there? The only reason I mention it, Brad, is that this enzyme, of all the enzymes I've ever worked on, is the most resistant to heat. But even it won't survive boiling. It survives reasonably well, pretty high temperatures. But if you get a good, vigorous rolling boil, you're going to kill that enzyme off. So absolutely no value to putting ascorbic acid into a boil. But it is something that we are experimenting with in the mash. The main advantage is that it does cut down color development. And for certain very pale beers, that might be very beneficial.
Well, Charlie, can you talk about some of the flaws we might actually see in a finished beer that hasn't been properly boiled?
Well, I think we've touched on a number of these. You run the risk of a DMS problem. Anything else that is supposed to be driven off in the boil will linger as well. I simply pick on DMS because it's a fairly straightforward thing to measure and detect, but you will get that and other vegetable characters and undesirable raw characters which survive if you have not got a good vigorous boil. You're jeopardizing your bitterness yield as well. You won't get as efficient protein precipitation. Therefore, you're not going to have as stable a product, it just will not be the wort for you, and it will actually give you an inferior product. I won't name the name. There's a fairly well-known story about when I first came over here, and a pretty well-known company asked me to advise them about their beer, and I said, truth? And they said, yeah. I said, it smells of halitosis. And it was awful. And literally it was because they had a lousy boil. And what they did was buy a new brewery and got a vigorous rolling boil. They actually did employ a very, very good brewer, and they win prizes for their beer these days. It's not entirely thanks to me. In fact, probably very little of it is. But I did point out to them that, you know, fundamentally, the first thing they had to improve was their boil, and they're doing okay now.
And we haven't talked a lot about it, but clarity is certainly one of the big benefits you can get, right?
It is. You know, one thing that people don't really realize, and is important, is whilst, yes, proteins and insoluble materials are precipitated out in the boil, and it's very important. Actually, you actually precipitate out a lot more protein in the mash, in the sweet wort production. So if you look at how much protein is lost, a lot more is lost when you produce the sweet wort than is lost actually in the boil. But it is important to have that vigorous boil. It's one of the stages where you are going to lose protein, and it's important. Another thing that happens actually, though, in the boil is this, that you actually do change some proteins in a desirable way. And I'm thinking now about foam.
Interesting.
There are different schools of thought, but one strong school of thought is that the main protein in beer, which stabilizes foam, is called lipid transfer protein, LTP. And actually, this comes from the grain, but if you take LTP out of malt, it's not very good. It's not a very good foam stabilizing agent. But if you extract it out of boiled wort, it's very good. And what happens in the boiling stage, it gets rearranged and transformed from a poorish sort of foam stabilizing protein to a very good one. So actually, a good vigorous boil is also, some people say, well, you'll lose foaming protein. You may lose some, actually forming some that are actually better. So it may be a nil-sum scenario. It might wash its face, but nonetheless, it's entirely bad news for foam. And of course, the other thing, of course, that is relevant in the boil, and we haven't talked about this, is you may add some further sugar and carbohydrate at this stage. Classic example of that is the Trappist monks with their candy sugar, which of course is produced from sugar beet. And this is a material which will contribute some pleasant sort of mellow caramelized sort of characters, but also, of course, gives you extra sugar to boost the fermentability of the worts in the production of Trappist ales. And so there's a lot to be said for using it at that stage. A lot of people, I realize that for some of your listeners, the word adjunct is a dirty word, but many people in the world do actually use what is called high maltose syrup, which is basically a material that's made from corn, and using enzymes in a sugar factory, the cornstarch is converted to a spectrum of sugars, which is very, very similar to that in wort. So it's primarily maltose, but there's a little bit of glucose and some maltotriose and so on, and about 20% dextrin. So its balance is very similar to that of the wort sugar. So there are brewers in the world who use this at maybe 15-20% of the total grist in the boiling stage to actually get, if you like, more bang for the buck. You're producing You don't have to have quite the same mashing and lautering capability. So by putting this high maltose syrup into the boil, you can actually boost the yield, if you like. It doesn't give you any amino acids. It doesn't give you any nitrogen, so you can't go too high, but about 15-20% is one way of making the wort go a bit further, should we say.
Is that a way of getting a little more alcohol into the beer too? Is it sort of a thinning agent?
Well, that's one way of doing it. You see, you can either consider it this way: you make a wort and put some of that in, therefore you got a more concentrated wort, and then you can then ferment it and produce a higher alcohol product. Or you can introduce it, by putting it into the bowl. You made sure everything's nice and sterile and so on, and then you can adjust the gravity to whatever you want and make your regular beer with a regular alcohol content. It's just that you'll get more wort. It extends the amount of wort you're going to produce.
That's awesome. Well, Charlie, we're coming up to the end here. I was wondering if you could just sum up for us your thoughts on the boil.
Vigor. The last thing in the world you want is a tepid simmer. You want a vigorous rolling boil, and you want to achieve it the same way every time. So, like everything else, it's consistency. And I realize that most people who are listening, they're probably not those who are going to have two different brew houses in different altitudes or something like that, unless they've got a holiday cottage where they brew up in the high ground. But if they have the same recipe and they live on the plain somewhere and they have a summer cottage, a mile high, and they try to make the same beer, the same two different locations, it will be different. So it's all about consistency. But number one, vigor.
That's not at all uncommon though for people to upgrade, for people to go from a 1 barrel brewery to a 10 barrel brewery or something like that. That
absolutely
happens all the time.
Yeah, absolutely right. So it's you've got to be mindful of that, and to an extent, it's going to be trial and error. It is going to be trial and error. And, you say, okay, let's try a different way of doing things. Can we get away with a shorter boil, but can we somehow get a gas stream going or something like that? I'm not sure how feasible that is on a smaller scale, but whatever it is, the important thing is consistency, but on traditional boiling systems, a vigorous boil.
Well, Charlie, is there anything else you'd like to add today?
No, I'm busy working on the third volume in my ASBC series.
Oh, I didn't get a chance to ask you about your books. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Please.
Well, why not? No.
I'll pull some of them up here on Amazon.
There you go. Oh, my. Wow.
There's a couple of them.
Yeah, the ASBC, American Society of Brewing Chemists, we're doing a series there. They're troubleshooting guides. The first one was on, I don't actually see it up there, but...
well, these are just for ones that come up first when I put your name in, so...
There you go. So the first one was on foam, the second one was on flavor, and the third one, which they're about to come round and break my knuckles if I don't get it out there soon, is all to do with flavor stability and freshness. So I'm hoping that will be finished and with the publishers at the end of March, and I hope before the end of the year we'll have that. And then the fourth one will be on physical stability and haze. But the flavor book, which is already out, that does have quite a lot in it about some of the things I've talked about today.
There's quite a few. You get quite a few books here. How many books have you written, Charlie? Lost count?
I'd have to add them up. So, about beer, somewhere between 10 and 20. I also wrote a book about goalkeepers.
Yes. You wanted to be a goalkeeper, I recall.
I did want to be a goalkeeper, but I think I'm past it now.
Was it? I'm trying to remember the team. It was Manchester?
Wolverhampton Wanderers, yes.
Oh, Wolverhampton, okay.
Yeah, so I still write about them. Actually, I was over at a former players' dinner just a few months ago because I know quite a lot of them and so on. So that's great. That's when I keep my mouth shut and just listen, and soak it all in. But yeah.
Well, Charlie, thanks again for being on the show. Really appreciate you being here.
Always a pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.
One of my favorite guests, again, Dr. Charlie Bamforth. He's professor of Malting and Brewing Science at the University of California at Davis. Charlie is the author of countless books on fermentation, beer quality, and beer. Thanks again, Charlie.
Pleasure.
Well, thanks again to Dr. Charlie Bamforth for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, where you get your 15% discount off their magazine or anything in their store if you use the offer code BeerSmith 2016 when you shop at beerandbrewing.com. Again, use the offer code BeerSmith 2016 and get your subscription now at beerandbrewing.com. And also Anvil, the new line of brewing equipment from Blickman Engineering. Kettles, burners, and accessories that are built to last. Get durable, reliable, high-quality brewing equipment with Anvil at anvilbrewing.com. Again, that's anvilbrewing.com. And finally, BeerSmith Mobile. Edit your recipes on the go on your iPhone, Android, or Kindle Fire device. You can find out more about BeerSmith Mobile at beersmith.com/mobile. If you enjoyed today's podcast, I encourage you to subscribe. You can subscribe on iTunes, subscribe on YouTube, or you can listen to us streaming 24/7 at beersmith.com/radio. And of course, you can find every episode on my blog at beersmith.com/blog. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great brewing week.